Imagine attending what you think is a routine Roman imperial wedding ceremony, complete with senators in their finest togas, religious officials conducting sacred rituals, and all the pomp and circumstance befitting the marriage of an emperor. But as you watch the proceedings unfold, you realize something is horrifically wrong. The bride isn't a noble Roman woman or foreign princess. It's a horse, decorated with jewels and silk, while the groom, Emperor Caligula, speaks vows to an animal as if it were his beloved wife. The assembled crowd watches in stunned silence, knowing that any protest could mean death, while the most powerful man in the ancient world consummates his madness in front of the entire Roman elite. But this impossible scene was only the beginning of what Caligula would do to his own family. This is the story of an emperor who didn't just blur the lines between sanity and madness, but obliterated them entirely, and how his incestuous obsession with his sister Drusilla would lead to acts so depraved that they shocked even the decadent Roman Empire. The story of Caligula's descent into absolute madness begins not with horses or incest, but with what appeared to be one of the most promising starts to any imperial reign in Roman history. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD, he was the son of the beloved general Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, making him part of the most prestigious family in the Roman world after the imperial dynasty itself. His childhood was spent in military camps along the Germanic frontier, where soldiers gave him the nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, because of the miniature military sandals he wore as a child. The troops adored him, seeing him as a symbol of their beloved commander, Germanicus, and the young boy grew up surrounded by the loyalty and respect of Rome's finest legions. When Caligula ascended to the throne in 37 AD, at the age of 24, Romans celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. His predecessor, Tiberius, had been a gloomy and suspicious ruler who spent his final years isolated on the island of Capri, leaving the empire in the hands of the sinister Praetorian prefect Sejanus. Caligula promised a return to the golden days of Augustus, with generous public games, magnificent building projects, and respect for the Senate and traditional Roman values. For the first few months of his reign, he seemed to deliver on these promises, releasing political prisoners, restoring democratic procedures, and lavishing money on public entertainment. Romans believed they had found the perfect emperor, young, handsome, intelligent, and connected to the glorious military traditions that had built their empire. But something was fundamentally wrong with Caligula's mind, something that would only become apparent as he grew comfortable with absolute power. Modern historians and psychologists have debated his condition for centuries, with theories ranging from temporal lobe epilepsy to bipolar disorder to simple psychopathy exacerbated by unlimited authority. Whatever the medical explanation, the transformation was swift and terrifying. Within 6 months of taking power, Caligula had begun displaying behaviors that ranged from merely eccentric to utterly deranged. And the empire that had celebrated his accession began to realize they had placed a monster on the throne. The first signs of his madness appeared in his treatment of the Roman Senate, the ancient institution that had governed Rome for centuries before the emperors. Where previous rulers had maintained at least the pretense of respecting senatorial dignity, Caligula began humiliating senators in increasingly creative and cruel ways. He forced elderly senators to run alongside his chariot in full ceremonial dress during sweltering summer heat, watching with delight as dignified men collapsed from exhaustion. He made senators stand for hours during his speeches, then berated them for showing signs of fatigue. Most infamously, he appointed his horse Incitatus to the Senate, declaring that the animal was more qualified to govern than the assembled representatives of Rome's greatest families. But the appointment of Incitatus was far more than a cruel joke at the Senate's expense. Caligula genuinely believed that his horse possessed supernatural intelligence and divine qualities that made it superior to human beings. He had a marble stable built for Incitatus, complete with an ivory manger and purple blankets. The horse was fed oats mixed with flakes of gold and given its own staff of servants, who attended to its every need. Caligula would consult Incitatus on matters of state, claiming that the horse gave him advice through supernatural communication that only he could understand. When senators questioned these consultations, Caligula responded with rage, insisting that anyone who doubted his horse's wisdom was guilty of treason against the state. The emperor's relationship with Incitatus became increasingly intimate and disturbing as his mental condition deteriorated. He spent hours alone with the horse, talking to it as if it were his closest confidant and most trusted advisor. Palace staff reported hearing Caligula having conversations with the animal, responding to whinnies and snorts as if they were profound philosophical observations. He began sleeping in the stable, claiming that Incitatus required his presence for protection against jealous humans who might try to harm such a perfect creature. It was during this period of escalating madness that Caligula announced his intention to marry Incitatus, declaring that their union would produce divine offspring that would rule the Roman Empire for eternity. The wedding ceremony, held in 39 AD, was conducted with all the solemnity and ritual significance of any imperial marriage. Incitatus was dressed in silk robes and adorned with jewelry worth more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. Caligula spoke traditional wedding vows to the horse, promising to love, honor, and protect his equine bride until death separated them. The assembled crowd of senators, courtiers, and religious officials watched in horrified fascination as their emperor consummated what he believed was a sacred marriage to an animal. But even this spectacular display of imperial insanity paled in comparison to what Caligula was simultaneously doing with his human family, particularly his sister Julia Drusilla. Born in 1680, Drusilla was 4 years younger than Caligula and had grown up alongside him in the same military camps and imperial palaces. Ancient sources describe her as extraordinarily beautiful, with the same charismatic presence that had initially made Caligula so popular with the Roman people. Brother and sister had always been close, but as Caligula's mental state deteriorated, their relationship evolved into something that shocked even a society accustomed to the sexual excesses of its rulers. The incestuous relationship between Caligula and Drusilla began sometime around 38 AD, when the emperor was already showing clear signs of mental instability. Unlike his bizarre fixation on his horse, which seemed to stem from delusional beliefs about animal consciousness and divine communication, his obsession with Drusilla appeared to be driven by a complex mixture of genuine sexual desire, psychological dominance, and a belief that their incestuous union would produce divinely blessed offspring. Ancient historians record that Caligula was not content with merely having sexual relations with his sister. He wanted to completely possess and control every aspect of her existence. Caligula began by moving Drusilla into his private chambers in the imperial palace, declaring that she was now his official concubine and would share his bed every night. This wasn't presented as a temporary arrangement or secret affair, but as a permanent restructuring of the imperial household that everyone was expected to accept and respect. Drusilla was given her own staff of servants, her own guards, and her own ceremonial role in imperial functions. She appeared beside Caligula at state dinners, religious ceremonies, and public appearances, clearly identified as his sexual partner despite their familial relationship. But Caligula's treatment of Drusilla went far beyond simple incest. He became obsessively controlling of every aspect of her life, determining what she could wear, whom she could speak to, and even what she was allowed to eat. He insisted on personally selecting her clothing each morning, often choosing outfits that emphasized her sexual availability to him, while making her uncomfortable around other people. He forbade her from having any private conversations with other family members, claiming that he needed to protect her from people who might try to turn her against him. Most disturbingly, he began referring to her not as his sister, but as his wife, despite the fact that he was already officially married to Livia or Drusilla, and would later marry Lalia, Paulina. The psychological impact of this treatment on Drusilla was devastating and profound. Ancient sources suggest that she initially resisted Caligula's advances, but his combination of imperial authority, physical intimidation, and emotional manipulation gradually wore down her resistance. She became increasingly isolated from other family members and friends, dependent entirely on Caligula's approval for her safety and survival. Palace observers noted that she began displaying signs of what we might recognize today as severe psychological trauma. She became withdrawn and nervous, started or flinched when people approached her unexpectedly, and seemed to live in constant fear of triggering her brother's unpredictable rages. What made the situation even more horrifying was Caligula's insistence that their incestuous relationship was not only natural but divinely ordained. He claimed that the gods had revealed to him that he and Drusilla were destined to produce a child, who would possess supernatural powers and rule the world as a living deity. This wasn't mere sexual gratification or even psychological dominance. In Caligula's deranged mind, he was fulfilling a cosmic destiny that would elevate both himself and his sister to the status of gods among mortals. To reinforce this divine narrative, Caligula began incorporating Drusilla into official religious ceremonies and state rituals in ways that clearly identified her as more than just his sister or even his concubine. She was given a role in sacrificial ceremonies traditionally reserved for priestesses or the wives of gods. He commissioned statues and paintings depicting the two of them as divine siblings, similar to mythological accounts of gods who married their sisters to preserve divine bloodlines. Most significantly, he began requiring Roman citizens to swear oaths, not just to his own divine status, but to Drusilla's as well, treating her as a goddess in her own right, rather than merely the emperor's sexual partner. The reaction from Roman society to these developments was a mixture of horror, disgust, and carefully concealed outrage. Romans were certainly familiar with sexual excess among their rulers. Previous emperors had maintained harems, engaged in adultery, and indulged in various forms of sexual experimentation that would have been scandalous among ordinary citizens. But the open practice of incest, combined with the requirement that citizens treat the relationship as religiously significant, crossed lines that even the most dissolute Romans found unacceptable. Traditional Roman religion included stories of gods who had married their siblings, but these were understood as mythological narratives that explained natural phenomena or justified religious practices. The idea that a living emperor could claim divine status based on his incestuous relationship with his sister challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mortals and gods, between imperial authority and religious tradition, and between acceptable and unacceptable sexual behavior, even among the elite. The situation became even more complex and disturbing. When Drusilla became pregnant in early 38 AD, Caligula was ecstatic, declaring that their child would be born with divine attributes, and would eventually rule not just the Roman Empire, but the entire world. He immediately began making preparations for what he called a divine birth, commissioning special ceremonies, ordering the construction of a new palace wing to serve as a sacred nursery, and requiring priests throughout the empire to conduct special sacrifices to ensure the child's supernatural development. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage after just a few months, devastating both Caligula and Drusilla in different ways. For the emperor, the loss represented not just personal tragedy, but the failure of what he believed was a cosmic plan ordained by the gods themselves. He became convinced that enemies had used magic to destroy his divine offspring, and he began a reign of terror against anyone he suspected of practicing witchcraft or harboring ill will toward his family. Palace staff, senators, and even random citizens were executed on suspicion of using supernatural means to harm the imperial child. For Drusilla, the miscarriage represented both personal loss and the collapse of her hope that producing an heir might somehow improve her impossible situation. Ancient sources suggest that she had convinced herself that successful childbirth might lead to greater independence, or at least a more stable position within the imperial household. The loss of the pregnancy left her more vulnerable than ever to Caligula's increasingly erratic behavior and growing paranoia about threats to his family. The emperor's response to the miscarriage revealed new depths of his madness and cruelty. Rather than accepting the loss as a natural tragedy, he became obsessed with the idea that Drusilla had somehow been responsible for the death of their divine child. He began subjecting her to increasingly harsh treatment, alternating between tender affection and violent rage, depending on his interpretation of her behavior and loyalty. He hired physicians to examine her constantly, searching for evidence that she had deliberately caused the miscarriage or was hiding some physical condition that made her unworthy of bearing divine offspring. Most disturbingly, Caligula began forcing Drusilla to participate in bizarre rituals, designed to purify her for future pregnancy and demonstrate her complete submission to his will. These ceremonies, conducted in private chambers with only trusted servants present, involved a combination of sexual humiliation, religious incantation, and psychological abuse that pushed Drusilla toward complete psychological breakdown. Ancient historians hint at the nature of these rituals, without providing explicit details, but contemporary accounts suggest that they involved practices that would have been considered extreme even in a culture where sexual violence against women was relatively common. The crisis reached its peak in June 38 AD, when Drusilla suddenly fell seriously ill with what palace physicians described as a fever and wasting disease that didn't respond to any available treatments. Modern historians have debated whether her illness was natural, the result of poisoning, or a psychosomatic response to the trauma of her situation. What's clear is that as her condition deteriorated, Caligula's behavior became even more erratic and dangerous. He spent days and nights at her bedside, alternating between prayers to various gods, threats against physicians who couldn't cure her, and increasingly desperate attempts to use his imperial authority to command her recovery. When Drusilla died on June 10, 38 AD, at the age of 22, Caligula's response exceeded even his previous displays of madness and excess. Rather than conducting normal funeral rites or accepting his sister's death as natural tragedy, he declared that Drusilla had been murdered by his enemies and that her death was part of a conspiracy against the imperial family. He immediately ordered the execution of several palace physicians, claiming they had failed to provide adequate care, and began a wider purge of anyone he suspected of harboring ill will toward his sister. But Caligula's reaction went far beyond simple revenge against perceived enemies. In his deranged grief, he decided that Drusilla's death was not permanent, but merely a temporary separation that could be overcome through appropriate divine intervention. He declared that his sister had not died, but had been transformed into a goddess, and he established an official cult dedicated to her worship that all Roman citizens were required to participate in. Temples were built throughout the empire, dedicated to Drusilla, the divine, and professional priests were appointed to conduct daily sacrifices and ceremonies in her honor. Most bizarrely of all, Caligula began claiming that Drusilla was communicating with him from beyond death, providing guidance on imperial policy and personal decisions. He would spend hours alone in her former chambers, having conversations with what he claimed was her divine spirit. Palace staff reported hearing him speaking passionately to empty air, responding to voices that only he could hear, and making important decisions based on what he insisted were Drusilla's supernatural instructions, just as he had claimed special communication with his horse, Incitatus. He now insisted that his dead sister possessed divine wisdom that made her the most qualified advisor in his government. The emperor's obsession with his dead sister began to consume every aspect of imperial administration and Roman religious life. He required senators to swear oaths to Drusilla's divinity, appointed her to posthumous government positions, and even claimed that she was providing supernatural protection for the empire against its enemies. Citizens throughout the Roman world found themselves legally obligated to worship a young woman who had died, under mysterious circumstances, after being sexually abused by her own brother, a situation that created widespread religious confusion and political tension. What made the situation even more disturbing was Caligula's insistence that his relationship with Drusilla had not ended with her death, but had simply evolved into a different form of divine marriage. He began claiming that they were now united as god and goddess, ruling the Roman Empire together from both earthly and celestial realms. This wasn't presented as metaphorical or symbolic language, but as literal truth that all imperial subjects were expected to accept and incorporate into their own religious beliefs and practices. The psychological and political consequences of these developments were catastrophic for both Caligula himself and the Roman Empire as a whole. The emperor's complete break with reality made effective governance impossible, while his religious innovations created widespread confusion and resistance among citizens who found themselves required to worship figures and practices that violated their deepest moral and spiritual convictions. The combination of his marriage to a horse, his incestuous relationship with his sister, and his establishment of cults devoted to both, created a climate of fear, disgust, and barely contained rebellion throughout the Roman world. By 40 AD, just 3 years after his promising accession to power, Caligula had become the most hated and feared emperor in Roman history. His sexual excesses, religious innovations, and complete disconnection from reality had created enemies among every segment of Roman society, from the Senate and military officers to ordinary citizens who found their religious beliefs and moral values under constant assault. The emperor, who had once been celebrated as the perfect heir to Augustus, had become a living symbol of how absolute power could corrupt and destroy even the most promising individuals. The end came on January 24, 41 AD, when a group of Praetorian Guard officers and senators assassinated Caligula in the underground passages of his palace. The conspirators had initially planned to kill only the emperor, but they also murdered his fourth wife, Caesania, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, named after his beloved sister, to prevent any possibility of dynastic continuation. The man who had married his horse violated his sister and claimed divine status for both himself and his dead family members, died in a pool of his own blood, abandoned by everyone except a few loyal servants who were too frightened to defend him. In death, Caligula's legacy became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited power and the thin line between genius and madness. His reign demonstrated how quickly a promising young ruler could descend into complete insanity when surrounded by people too fearful to challenge his increasingly deranged behavior. The Roman Empire learned from his example, implementing new safeguards and traditions designed to prevent future emperors from exercising the kind of absolute authority that had allowed Caligula to transform his personal obsessions into imperial law. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Caligula's story isn't his own descent into madness, but the way his insanity destroyed the lives of innocent people who happened to be close to him. Drusilla, who never chose to be the object of her brother's incestuous obsession, died young after years of abuse and trauma that contemporary medicine was powerless to treat. Even his horse, Incitatus, bizarre as it sounds, was a victim of imperial madness, an animal that became the unwitting symbol of human corruption and political chaos. The story of Caligula reminds us that behind every historical narrative of political excess and imperial decadence, there are individual human costs that extend far beyond the primary actors. A young woman's life was destroyed by her brother's sexual obsession. An entire empire was traumatized by one man's religious delusions. And countless innocent people suffered and died because they happened to live under a ruler whose grip on reality had completely dissolved. Modern historians continue to debate the exact nature of Caligula's mental condition, but there is no debate about the consequences of allowing unlimited power to concentrate in the hands of someone incapable of distinguishing between personal fantasy and political reality. His reign serves as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous rulers are often not those who are simply evil, but those who are completely insane and surrounded by people too frightened or too corrupt to stop them. If this story of imperial madness, sexual excess, and the tragic cost of unlimited power has affected you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Caligula's reign do you find most disturbing? His marriage to a horse, his incestuous abuse of his sister, or the way an entire empire was forced to participate in his delusions? And if you're interested in more stories about how absolute power corrupted the rulers of the ancient world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because history is full of leaders whose descent into madness left lasting scars on the civilizations they were supposed to protect. Thank you for joining me in exploring one of the most disturbing examples of how unlimited authority can transform promising individuals into monsters whose personal obsessions become everyone else's nightmare.